In the beginning, there was only a buzzer. What you're hearing is Pong, 1972. It was an arcade game, and it was the first commercially available video game. And of course, it had the first video game sounds. The designer, Al Alcorn, tells a great story about the origin of these sounds. Alcorn said, "People have talked about the sound, and I've seen articles written about how intelligently the sound was done, how appropriate the sound was. The truth is, I was running out of parts on the board. Nolan Bushnell, the founder of Atari, wanted the roar of a crowd of thousands, the approving roar of cheering people when you made a point. Ted Dabney told me to make a boo and a hiss when you lost a point, because for every winner, there's a loser. I said, screw it. I don't know how to make any of these sounds. I don't have enough parts anyhow. Since I had the wire wrapped on the scope, I poked around in the sync generator to find an appropriate frequency or a tone. So these sounds were done in half a day. They were the sounds that were already in the machine." So what Alcorn is talking about here is the fact that every arcade game was designed and built from scratch to suit the needs of the game. There's no actual source code for Pong. What it has is transistors. Everything is mechanical and electronic to create this game. So when he says I don't have enough parts, he's talking about the fact that when you were designing an arcade game, you had to really balance the profit versus the cost of producing the game. You had to think about the physical space, you had to think about the power you had available, you had to think about how to create a game that did exactly what you needed it to do while still being affordable to produce so that you could sell it to bar owners, arcade owners, and the like for profit. So there's a very humble origin story to all of video game sound. So what we're going to look at in this series of lecture videos is the history of early game sound, some of the most relevant important examples of early game sounds, and we're going to think about a series of questions here. First of all, how did we get from the earliest forms of computing technology, the early forms of computing from the 1940s, 50s, 60s, predating video games? How did we get from these early computational devices up through the first arcade machines like Pong in 1972, and finally to the home consoles that we recognize, starting with things like the Atari 2600, the Nintendo in the 80s, and continuing on through today? In other words, what is the history of what we think of as retro gaming and game sound, and in fact, even the prehistory? How did early game developers work within hardware and software constraints to pursue their creative visions? We've already seen one example of that with Alcorn making Pong. Finally, what is the legacy of retro aesthetics in the video games of today? So let's start with a few milestones. As I said, computing as we know it began in the 1940s during and immediately after World War II. Video games, as we know them, started in 1962 with Space War, the first screen-based video game developed by some graduate students at MIT who were supposed to be working on more serious things. Almost a decade later, Computer Space, which was a version of Space War, became the first arcade video game and the first commercially sold game available in your local pizza parlor, bowling alley, whatever. Space War was played on a mainframe in a lab, but Computer Space, you could actually buy a cabinet and put it in your business. Pong, 1 year later, is what really launched the coin-operated video game industry. Late in 1972, early 1973, we saw the Magnavox Odyssey, which was the first home video game console. The first time you could walk into a store, buy a console, take it home, and play games on your TV. It was almost comically simple, though. The Odyssey was just one box with, I think it's 11 preloaded games. There's no way to expand it, and those games are very, very limited, as we'll see. 1977, several years later, is when Atari would come out with the Atari VCS for Video Computer System, often called the Atari 2600 as well, since its predecessor was called the 5200. They sort of retroactively came up with this naming scheme. But originally it was the VCS, and that's what many people still refer to it as. So 1977, the first system that allows you to have interchangeable games where you can go out, pick the game that you want off the shelf, bring it home and play it. Atari had several really successful years up until about 1982 to 1983, which is when we had what we call the Great Video Game Crash. Essentially, this was market oversaturation, a sort of gradual decline in quality of games, or an attempt to have a lot of cheap, quick cash-in games where consumers really felt like they were getting burned, and people started to suspect that maybe video games at home on your TV are just kind of a fad. Maybe we're coming to the end of it. So the video game market in the US really takes a nosedive in 1983, 84, until about 1985 when the Nintendo arrives on our shores. It came out in 1983 in Japan as the Famicom, but was brought to the US and then later to Europe as the Nintendo Entertainment System. And this really revived the video game industry and set it on its upward trajectory that it's still on today. So throughout this series on early game sound, you're going to hear a couple of recurring features here that I'd like to summarize first. Number one, minimalism and abstraction. The early technologies had very, very little going on. The simplest things like Pong, one channel, some digital buzzing, and things went up from there. Usually these early game systems are limited to very simple synthesis, usually only a couple of channels. You know, the Atari has 3 channels of sound. The Nintendo Entertainment System has 5 channels. Mostly these are very simple wave synthesis, or eventually, as you get to the Nintendo, really limited, grainy, low-quality sampling. So the soundtracks are very sparse, suggestive. You're more likely to hear a couple recognizable notes of a tune that sort of tells you what you should be hearing, but you don't usually hear the whole thing. You don't usually hear background music. Things are very, very limited. With these limitations also came creative solutions. Not only things like Alcorn creating sound by passing some voltage through a speaker, but also creative things, for instance, including tapes in your arcade cabinet so you could play music, or my favorite example has a heavy wooden block inside of a Qbert arcade cabinet so that the block could fall and it would imitate the sound of your character falling in the cabinet. There were also a lot of unique solutions here. As I said, arcade cabinets were custom built to suit the needs of a game. So if you really needed certain things in your sound design, such as maybe a sit-down cabinet where you're going to have speakers in front and behind the player, you could do this, although the scope was often very limited by the production cost and the commercial cost and viability for profitability. Finally, we're going to see the exploration of new technologies really quickly. Game sound really increases in complexity with each new wave of video game systems, from Pong to the Atari, for instance, to the Nintendo. By the time we get to the next generation after Nintendo, you know, the Sega Genesis or Master System, you know, the Super Nintendo, the capabilities are really getting better each time. You know, the power in terms of graphics gets better, the processing power, and also the sound. And the miniaturization and the improvement of these technologies helps game designers and sound designers to do much more with less space, fewer resources. They can get more creative and eventually create richer and more satisfying soundtracks.